Would you offer a hand out of pity or a chance to reclaim dignity? One simple choice made by Vance sparked a transformation that no one saw coming. The city street was alive with movement, the pulse of a world that never slowed down. J.D. Vance moved through the crowd with a different kind of rhythm. His strides were steady, purposeful, though his mind was far from focused on the frenetic pace around him. He had just finished a meeting with a publisher, and his thoughts lingered on the conversation, the lingering question of whether his next book would find its place in the world. Vance, known for his work on societal issues and personal reflections, walked the street almost absent-mindedly, his gaze often falling on the faces of people around him, each seemingly engrossed in their own battles and struggles. But today, his attention was caught by something else. A man stood by the sidewalk, leaning against the brick wall of a dilapidated building. His clothes were ragged, his hair matted with dirt, and his face was weathered by time and hardship. He appeared out of place among the polished suits and hurried footsteps, but there was something about his stillness that contrasted sharply with the chaotic movement of the crowd. His eyes, tired and uncertain, followed the stream of passers-by as if waiting for someone, anyone, to acknowledge his presence. As Vance approached, the man's gaze shifted. Their eyes met for a split second, a silent recognition of two lives that, in this moment, were bound by proximity and circumstance. Then, without warning, the homeless man straightened up slightly, and in a voice hoarse from lack of use, he spoke. "Can you give me $1?" His words were simple, but they carried an unmistakable weight of desperation. His hand extended, trembling slightly, as if the very act of asking had cost him something vital. Vance paused, momentarily taken aback by the directness of the request. There were so many ways he could respond: ignore him, brush past him, or offer a coin. But something stopped him. The moment lingered. For a brief instant, Vance noticed the way the man's hand shook, the subtle fear in his eyes, as if asking for help was something foreign to him, something he hadn't done in a long time. Vance's mind whirred, torn between the usual impulse to dismiss and the rare, fleeting curiosity that tugged at him. His gaze flickered to the man's face again, the deep lines of struggle etched there, and then back to the hand still extended, waiting. He could see the weight of years, no, decades of hardship in that gesture, as if the man was not just asking for $1, but for something far more intangible: dignity, a moment of connection, perhaps even hope. After a brief pause, Vance found himself reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a crisp dollar bill, the kind you might find in a clean wallet, untouched by time. Without a second thought, he handed it to the man. But just as the dollar was about to reach the homeless man's waiting hand, Vance stopped. He held it there, the paper bill suspended between them, and looked the man directly in the eyes. "I'll give you the dollar," Vance said, his voice calm but deliberate. "But I need you to do something for me in return." The homeless man blinked, his confusion deepening. He wasn't used to this, wasn't accustomed to being asked to give something in return for what little he was being offered. He looked at the dollar in Vance's hand, his mind racing. He was caught between the overwhelming desire for something, anything to ease his current situation, and the strange weight of Vance's words. "What do you mean?" the man asked slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Vance's gaze softened, but there was something firm in his demeanor. "I want you to make one choice for yourself today," he said. "Just one. No matter how small it is, you decide what you want. What will it be?" The homeless man blinked again, his eyes flickering between the dollar and Vance's steady gaze. His lips parted, but no words came out at first. What kind of choice could he make? He had no home, no job, no possessions beyond the clothes on his back and the few items he carried in a plastic bag. He had long since stopped making decisions that mattered, had stopped believing that his choices had any value. His mind was a tangle of confusion. The thought of making a choice, of deciding something for himself, felt foreign, almost impossible. His life had been reduced to survival, to getting by on whatever he could find, whatever he could beg for. But now this man standing before him, offering him $1 with a strange request, had introduced a concept that was almost too difficult to grasp. The homeless man's hand hovered in the air, uncertainty clouding his features. I don't, he trailed off, not sure how to respond. Could he even make a decision? And if he did, would it even matter? Vance watched him silently, his expression one of patience, allowing the man space to process. After what seemed like an eternity, the homeless man finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can. I don't remember how to make choices anymore. Vance nodded slowly. That's okay, he said quietly, handing the dollar over without hesitation. But today you get to try. The exchange was simple, but something shifted in the air between them. A quiet recognition of possibility, a flicker of something that had been dormant for far too long. The homeless man took the dollar, his fingers brushing against Vance's for a moment, the first human connection he'd felt in God knew how long. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the faintest spark of hope. The dollar in the homeless man's hand felt like an anchor, heavy with both promise and uncertainty. He stood there for a moment, fingers trembling around the bill, his mind racing, his heart thudding in his chest. The world around him was still moving, people bustling past, the sounds of the city swirling. But in this tiny, suspended moment, everything felt different. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had given him something with the expectation of nothing in return. Most of the time, he was either ignored or dismissed, treated as an inconvenience at best, a ghost at worst. Make a choice for yourself today. The words echoed in his mind, a quiet challenge that stirred something deep within him. But what choice could he make? The world had taught him long ago that he didn't get to decide much. The streets, the shelters, the hunger, the cold, each of these things had been foisted upon him. Every day had been a struggle just to survive, to get by. The homeless man, whose name was Tom, couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly in control of anything. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push away the flood of thoughts threatening to overwhelm him. His mind drifted to past decisions, decisions he hadn't really made, but ones that had been made for him by circumstances. There was the time he had been in a shelter and had asked for a clean shirt, only to be told there were none left. Or the time he had tried to get a job, only to be told that he wasn't what they were looking for. Each of these moments had chipped away at his sense of agency, each one reinforcing the idea that his choices didn't matter, that they never had. He thought back further to when he was a young man, just starting out in life. There had been a time when he felt like he had potential, when his choices were his to make. Back then, he had a family, a home, a future. He had dreams, things he wanted to do, places he wanted to go. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had slipped through his fingers. A divorce, a series of bad decisions, the slow unraveling of everything he had once known. And now, here he was, standing on the edge of the street, holding a dollar with no real sense of what to do with it. The weight of it all pressed in on him. Could he really make a decision for himself again? Could he reclaim a fragment of his autonomy? Tom's eyes flickered over to the deli across the street. The neon sign buzzed faintly, a red beacon in the gray afternoon light. It was a modest place, the kind of restaurant where you could get a warm meal for a few bucks, a place where you weren't judged for your clothes or the way you looked. For a moment he stood there watching the people inside through the window. They were laughing, talking, eating. They were living. His stomach growled. The hunger had been gnawing at him for hours, maybe days. It wasn't the first time he'd gone without a meal, but something about this moment was different. The dollar felt like an opportunity, a way out of the hunger that had gripped him for so long. He glanced down at the bill again, feeling its smooth surface between his fingers. Just one choice, Tom. His hand tightened around the dollar. This was his chance. Not just for food, but for something more. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He didn't know how to explain it, but he felt something stir inside him, a quiet flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this small act could be the beginning of something else. Something that wasn't defined by the streets, by the shelters, by the pain of not knowing where his next meal would come from. Without another thought, Tom started walking toward the deli. His legs felt heavier than usual, the weight of uncertainty still hanging around him like a cloak. But with each step, he felt the faintest sense of control returning. His decision felt small, but in that moment, it was everything. When he pushed open the door to the deli, the warmth inside hit him like a wave. The smell of freshly made sandwiches and sizzling meat filled the air. And for the first time in a long time, Tom felt a deep, aching hunger that wasn't just for food, but for something more. Something intangible that he couldn't quite name. He stood at the counter, looking at the menu board above, and for the first time in what felt like ages, he allowed himself the luxury of choice. "Can I help you?" the cashier asked, her voice friendly but neutral. Tom cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how his voice cracked, how his appearance must look. He could feel the weight of his ragged clothes, the stubble on his face, the smell of the streets on him, but he pushed it aside. He had made a decision. "I'll have the special," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "And a bottle of water, please." The cashier nodded, punching in the order. Tom reached into his pocket for the dollar, and as he handed it over, he felt a strange sense of pride. It wasn't much, just one small meal, but it was his. It was a decision he had made for himself. As he sat down at a small table by the window, he picked up the sandwich and took a bite. The food tasted better than he had expected, as though the simple act of choosing it had added a richness to the flavor. He chewed slowly, savoring the warmth that spread through him, the fullness that came not just from the food, but from the realization that he had taken control, however briefly, over something in his life. For the first time in a long time, Tom felt something stir inside him. It wasn't just hunger being satisfied, it was a quiet shift, a small but undeniable recognition that he still had power, that he still had the ability to make choices, however small. He looked out the window, watching the people outside moving in a blur of purpose. He wasn't sure what would happen tomorrow, or the day after that, but for now, for this moment, he had made a choice, and that was enough. Unbeknownst to Tom, Vance had been watching from across the street, standing by the entrance to a bookstore. He had noticed the man's hesitant steps toward the deli, the way he had taken his time deciding, the way his posture had shifted ever so slightly after the decision was made. Vance could see it in the way the man sat down with his sandwich, the small but noticeable change in his body language, a shift from uncertainty to something that looked almost like pride. Vance smiled to himself, a quiet sense of satisfaction washing over him. It was a small thing, but it mattered. This was the beginning of something, maybe not a revolution, but a step in the right direction. He could see it in the way Tom was eating, the way he was being in that moment. It was as though he had realized, however briefly, that he wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. And that, Vance thought, was the first real choice he had made in a long time. The day stretched out before Tom like a canvas, blank and full of possibilities. After that first meal, something inside him had begun to shift. It wasn't a grand revelation, nor a sudden change in fortune, but it was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. A sense that, for the first time in a long time, he was in control, at least of small moments. And it felt good. For the first time in forever, he felt like a person again, not just a shadow drifting through the city. Tom wandered through the streets, unsure of where to go, but aware that the choices before him were his to make. He passed by familiar places, street corners where he usually asked for change, a busy intersection where the crowds of commuters passed in a blur. But today he didn't linger at those places. He kept moving, driven by a newfound sense of agency that was beginning to grow inside him, even if it was in small, hesitant bursts. And at one corner he stopped and looked at the park across the street. It was a peaceful space, shaded by old oak trees, the kind of place he had never considered sitting in before. The bench by the fountain always seemed to be occupied by people who had a place to go, a reason to sit there, while he had no such luxury. But today it was empty. He could sit there. It was his choice. Tom walked across the street, his steps uncertain but resolute. He found the bench, brushed off the crumbs from the last person who had sat there, and settled onto the cool wood. The sounds of the city seemed distant here, muffled by the leaves in the trees and the soft rush of the fountain. It was peaceful, and for once Tom didn't feel like he had to be anywhere else. He wasn't waiting for something to happen. He wasn't hoping for someone to notice him. He wasn't thinking about his next meal. He was just sitting, a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Later, as he walked down the street, Tom's eyes fell on a street vendor selling cold drinks from a cart. The man behind the cart was laughing, chatting with a customer, a picture of warmth and ease. Tom hesitated. He didn't usually spend money on things like that, things that weren't essential. But today, with the dollar still in his pocket, he realized he could. It was his choice. "Can I have a lemonade?" he asked, his voice steady. The vendor nodded, handing over the drink, and Tom paid with the dollar Vance had given him. The cold drink felt like another small indulgence, but it also felt like a declaration. He was choosing to enjoy something, to nourish himself in a way he hadn't allowed himself to do in years. As he sipped the lemonade, Tom felt a warmth spread through him, not just from the drink, but from the realization that he could make these choices. They were simple choices, small decisions that didn't seem to matter to anyone else, but they mattered to him. They added up, and each one, however tiny, made him feel more human, more capable. Vance, who had been quietly following from a distance, noticed the shift in Tom's demeanor. From his vantage point across the street, Vance could see the way the homeless man carried himself now, slightly straighter, less burdened. He had been watching him ever since he left the deli, not to interfere or intrude, but simply to observe, and what he saw filled him with a quiet sense of hope. Where Tom had once been hunched and withdrawn, there was now a flicker of something else in his movements, a subtle spark of determination, a lightness to his steps that hadn't been there before. Vance couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was something different in the way Tom was walking. He was still a long way from being fixed, but the man was starting to make decisions that were his own, to claim small moments of autonomy. It was the beginning of something. Vance could sense that much, and that was enough for now. He watched as Tom chose to walk down a different street, one that was quieter, less crowded. He could have stayed in the bustle of the main avenue, where the chaos and noise were familiar, where people didn't stop to look at him. But he chose the quieter street, and as he walked, Vance noticed the subtle change in his posture, more confident, less resigned. Tom's thoughts swirled as he walked, the lemonade still in his hand. With each step, he felt a little lighter, a little freer. He wasn't sure why, but something in his chest had shifted. The heaviness of his usual routine, the waiting, the begging, the constant feeling of being at the mercy of others, had lifted. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it had loosened its grip just a bit. He passed a small convenience store, and on impulse he walked inside. He had never been one to buy snacks. He usually only took what was given to him or what he could find. But today was different. Today he was making choices. He picked up a bag of chips and a chocolate bar. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was his decision. When he sat on the low wall outside the store, eating the chips and savoring the sweet chocolate, he couldn't help but reflect on what had changed. The decisions he had made today, sitting on the park bench, buying the drink, picking a quiet street to walk down, treating himself to snacks, were simple, almost trivial in the grand scheme of things. But to him they felt monumental. For so long his life had been about surviving, about getting by on the smallest scraps of whatever was offered. But now he was taking the scraps and making something of them, turning them into moments of choice, of agency. And it felt good. It felt empowering. Vance, still a few paces behind, saw the quiet shift in Tom. He saw the way the man's eyes looked a little brighter, the way his shoulders were squared just a bit more. The weight of the world had not magically disappeared, but Tom was carrying it differently now. His steps were more purposeful. There was a glimmer of hope in his demeanor that hadn't been there earlier that morning. Vance wasn't sure what would happen next for Tom. He didn't know if this day of small choices would lead to a permanent change, or if it would fade with the sunset. But for now it was enough. Tom had taken the first step, and in a world that often left people like him behind, that small act of choosing had been a victory. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Tom found himself walking toward the bus stop. He had no real destination, but he wasn't wandering anymore. He was moving with purpose. And when he reached the bench at the bus stop, he sat down, his body sinking into the seat with a quiet satisfaction. The day had been full of small victories, small moments of autonomy that, while seemingly insignificant to anyone watching, were monumental to him. He had made choices, and that, for the first time in a long time, was enough. The sky had begun to darken as evening settled over the city, the fading light casting long shadows across the pavement. Tom wandered through the quieter streets, his legs aching from the day's journey, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. The small victories were adding up. Each choice, each action, felt like a brushstroke in a picture he was beginning to understand. He was learning how to make decisions again, how to take the reins of his life, even in the smallest ways. But now, with dusk settling in, Tom's thoughts began to drift toward hunger. He hadn't eaten much since that morning. The lemonade, the snack, the bits of food he'd managed to grab throughout the day. All of it had been enough to keep him going, but he was starting to feel a deeper craving. It wasn't just for food, it was for something more substantial, something that wasn't about getting by, but about treating himself, about doing something that felt normal. It felt like it was time for that next step, for something beyond mere survival. As he walked, Tom spotted a modest restaurant nestled between a laundromat and a small convenience store. The warm light spilling from the windows looked inviting, and for a moment he hesitated. He hadn't eaten in a place like this in years, certainly not since before he'd found himself living on the streets. The idea of sitting down and eating a meal at a restaurant, paying for it no less, was foreign to him now. But something stirred in him, a quiet voice that urged him forward. He checked the dollar in his pocket. He could do this. It was his choice. It might be a small step, but it felt monumental in its own way. Tom pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scent of freshly prepared food hit him almost immediately. Warm bread, roasting meats, vegetables sautéing in butter. It smelled like comfort. The restaurant was simple but cozy, with a few tables scattered around and a couple of patrons scattered in their own world, quietly eating their meals. The place was nothing fancy, but it felt like a small slice of normalcy. For the first time in a long while, it felt like a place he could belong. The host, a woman in her mid-30s, greeted him with a polite but somewhat curious glance. Tom felt a small knot of nervousness in his stomach. He hadn't been inside a restaurant like this in so long, and even though he wasn't dressed in rags, he knew how he probably appeared. A man who had been on the street for too long, someone whose clothes weren't fresh and whose face carried the marks of too many difficult days. But the woman simply smiled, and that simple kindness gave him a brief moment of courage. "Table for one?" she asked, her tone warm but professional. "Yeah, just one," Tom replied, his voice steady but soft. She led him to a small table by the window, where the last of the day's sunlight filtered through the glass, casting a golden glow over the worn wooden table. Tom sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out the dollar Vance had given him. His stomach churned, and not just from hunger. This was more than about food. This was about making a choice for himself. And though the nerves still twisted inside him, there was also a small thread of pride woven into his chest. This was a decision he was making for himself. It wasn't about surviving. It wasn't about asking for scraps. He was choosing to sit down and eat in a place like this. The waitress handed him a menu, and Tom scanned the options, his mind racing with thoughts. Should he just order something cheap, something small, or should he indulge in a full meal? He felt his anxiety rising as the weight of the decision settled on him. It wasn't about the money. He could afford a simple meal, maybe a sandwich or a bowl of soup. But what if the food wasn't enough? What if he felt out of place, like he didn't belong? For a moment, he nearly put the menu down and walked out. But then he remembered what he had already learned today. This was his choice. "I'll have the chicken soup and a piece of bread, please," Tom said, his voice firm this time. The waitress smiled, seeing not just the homeless man, but someone making a choice, just like any other diner. As she left to place his order, Tom leaned back, exhaling deeply. A part of him wanted to flee, but a stronger part urged him to stay. It wasn't just about eating. It was about honoring himself, about claiming the dignity of this moment. He watched people pass by outside, realizing how much he'd missed the simple act of sitting down to a meal, something he hadn't truly experienced in years. When his food arrived, the warmth of the soup comforted him, and with each bite, he felt something shift within. This wasn't just food, it was a step toward reclaiming his life. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just surviving, he was nourishing himself, making a choice, and feeling dignity return. Meanwhile, across the street, Vance stood just outside the restaurant's door, watching the scene unfold. He had kept his distance all day, but now he felt a quiet satisfaction watching Tom sit at the table, eating his meal like any other person. He saw the way Tom held his spoon, the way he took his time, savoring the moment instead of rushing through it. Vance had always believed in the power of personal agency, in the ability to make choices and take control of one's life. Today he had seen the first real sign of that in Tom, a man who had been living on the fringes of society, disconnected from the simple acts of living. And now he was choosing to participate, to engage, to reclaim his dignity. Vance felt a sense of peace in that moment. It wasn't a grand transformation, and it wasn't the end of Tom's journey, but it was a beginning. A small act of choice, an act of self-respect, could make all the difference. And Vance knew that this evening, sitting at that table, Tom had made a choice for himself. It was a step toward something greater, something better. As Tom finished his meal and stood up to leave, he felt lighter, as if the weight of his past had shifted, even if just a little. He walked out of the restaurant with his head a bit higher, his steps a bit more purposeful. The dollar had been more than just currency. It had been the catalyst for something new, something he wasn't sure he could define yet, but something he knew was worth holding on to. For the first time in a long time, Tom felt like he had control, like he had made a choice that mattered. And as he walked away from the restaurant, the evening air felt a little less heavy, and the world around him a little less daunting. Weeks passed, and the city seemed to carry on its usual rhythm. But for J.D. Vance, something was different, an unexpected sense of hope lingering within him. As he walked down the same street where he had encountered the homeless man, he spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was Tom. The transformation was striking. Tom, once hunched and uncertain, now stood tall, his posture confident. He was dressed in clean clothes, his face healthier, his eyes sharper. A sense of calm surrounded him, a stark contrast to the man who had once asked for a mere dollar. "Mr. Vance?" Tom's voice was steady, full of gratitude. "I want to thank you for that day, giving me that dollar. It wasn't the money that changed me, though. It was the chance to make a choice for myself." And Vance looked at him, surprised and moved by the man's transformation. "It seems like it made a bigger difference than I thought." Tom nodded. "That dollar, it was a turning point. After that, I found temporary work at a shelter, and with a sense of purpose, I started saving. Slowly, I managed to rent a small apartment. I've got a steady job now. Nothing glamorous, but it's enough. I'm starting over." Vance couldn't help but smile, feeling a warmth spread through him. He had given so little, yet it had sparked something incredible in Tom. But Tom wasn't done yet. "I want to give back," Tom continued. "I volunteer at the shelter now, helping others who are where I used to be. I want to show them the same thing you showed me, that they have choices, that they can take control of their lives." Vance was taken aback by Tom's selflessness. "That's incredible, Tom. You've come a long way." Tom grinned. "It's not just about me anymore. It's about showing others they can rise too." As Vance watched Tom walk away, he reflected on how a single moment of engagement had set off a chain of events. Something as simple as a dollar and a choice had made all the difference. He realized that true empowerment didn't come from giving answers. It came from helping others find their own. Tom walked on, his steps filled with purpose, while Vance felt a renewed sense of hope. The smallest choices could create the greatest transformations.